Just after midnight on the 4th of August, 1991, a man climbed a staircase on a cruise ship leaning 15 degrees to one side and pushed open the door to the bridge. The instruments were lit, the charts were open, the radio was on, and there was nobody in the room, not one officer. The man in the doorway had no rank at all. He played guitar in the ship's lounge band. Over the next 5 hours, every single one of the 571 people on board would get off that ship alive, and not one of the men paid to make that happen would have anything to do with it. Which leaves one question hanging over the whole night, the one that followed this ship's captain for the rest of his life. Where was he? Welcome to Mortwick, the Dark Records. On the 3rd of August, 1991, a 38-year-old liner on her 5th name left East London for Durban on a short coastal cruise. She left late, delayed by a bomb threat that turned out to be nothing, which is the least interesting bad omen in this story. On board, families, a lounge band, a magician, a cabaret singer. Outside, the wild coast was doing what it does in August, 40-knot winds and swells running to 9 meters. Dinner was a comedy, plates sliding off tables, chairs walking across the dining room, half the passengers gone to lie down. Nobody was frightened yet. This was just weather. Then, at around 9:30, there was a muffled explosion somewhere below, and the lights went out. If you're already doing the maths on 9-metre swells and a 38-year-old hull, subscribe now. This channel opens exactly this kind of file, and the next one is already in the water. What happened next should not be possible on a passenger ship. No alarm was sounded. No announcement was made. The engine room was filling with seawater, and the people who had paid for their tickets worked it out the way you work things out at a bad party, by noticing that the staff had stopped making eye contact. Because the crew were leaving. Not all of them, but enough. Officers were making their way to the boat deck without waking anyone, without organizing anything, and, reportedly, without even closing the portholes behind them. So the entertainers did what entertainers do. Robin Boltman, the ship's magician, gathered the passengers into the lounge and kept them there. Alvon Collison sang, the band played, and somewhere between the second song and the third, the lounge act of the Oceanos turned into its command staff, which is a bit like the house band at a wedding ending up flying the plane home and somehow landing it. The storm didn't sink this ship. The storm just showed up at the right time. The Oceanos was finished in Bordeaux in 1953, and by 1991 she was on her 5th name, the Jean Laborde, then the Mykenai, then the Ancona, then the Eastern Princess, before a Greek line called Epirodiki made her the Oceanos. 38 years of refits, new owners, and new paperwork, and somewhere in all of that work, somebody had opened up her plumbing. 5 names in 38 years, this ship had more stage names than Prince, and roughly the same amount of paperwork explaining them. A modern ship survives a hold because it is divided into sealed compartments. Flood one, the others hold. That only works if the walls between them are actually walls. On the Oceanos, a pipe from the waste system ran straight through one of those watertight bulkheads, and during earlier repair work, its non-return valves had been taken out. They were never put back. Accounts of that night describe a 10-centimetre opening between the generator space and the sewage tank. 10 centimeters. Once the sea found it, it didn't stay in one compartment. It went wherever the plumbing went, which is everywhere. The most elegant ship on that coast was sunk through her own sewage system by a hole the size of a coffee cup in the one wall that mattered. It's the Death Star exhaust port, except nobody had to fly the trench run. Somebody just forgot to put the valves back. So the real question isn't what the sea did that night. It's who knew. Somebody signed that job off. Somebody walked past that bulkhead for months and said nothing. By now the list was serious, and the passengers wanted someone in charge. The cruise director went up to the bridge to ask for orders and came back saying the bridge was empty. Nobody believed her. So the guitarist went to look himself, and that is the scene we opened with. He picked up the radio phone. In his own account, they took turns calling mayday, mayday into the dark until a ship finally answered, a Dutch container vessel, the Ned Lloyd Mauritius, which turned around and came for them. And then her captain, quite reasonably, asked the voice on the radio for his rank. There was, he remembers, a short pause on the line. Then the Dutch captain came back and calmly began walking a guitarist through how to keep a sinking ship pointed the right way. South African papers later ran a cartoon of a tiny figure alone on the bridge of a listing liner, captioned, "This is your lead guitarist speaking." The lifeboats were their own disaster. Some went into the water with engines that wouldn't start, drifting off with as many as 90 people aboard. So the Dutch ship put her own boats out to shuttle them across. On deck, the cruise director ran the loading and put women and children in first, with no authority whatsoever, doing the exact job the ship's officers had been trained and paid for. At first light, the helicopters came, about 3 hours after that mayday went out. 16 helicopters answered the call, 13 of them South African Air Force Pumas. 9 of those Pumas worked directly over the ship, and off that deck alone they lifted 225 people. That needed someone standing on the deck itself, and the deck was now a wet steel slope. So the guitarist tied a rope around his waist, anchored it, and made himself the loading point. His wife controlled the flow from cover. On his signal, she would send passengers out to him, 2 at a time. Harness on, thumbs up, gone. Then 2 more, for 5 hours. He reckons 10 or 12 of them lost their footing and slid down that deck while he was clipping them in. Every time, he went down the slope after them and brought them back. Nobody was lost. Which brings us back to the question we opened with. Because at some point that morning, still looking for anyone with authority, the guitarist found the captain of the Oceanos. He was on the pool deck, among the passengers, keeping a low profile under a stairway, crouched there, smoking. In the guitarist's own account, the captain looked like a man in deep shock. Shortly after that, Captain Yanis Avranis got into one of the first helicopters off the ship and left, with something like 170 people still on board. The guitarist stayed until the deck was empty. He was one of the last human beings to leave the Oceanos. At about 3:30 that afternoon, the Oceanos rolled onto her side and sank by the bow, roughly 45 minutes after the last person was lifted off her. 571 aboard, 571 alive. One of the largest peacetime sea rescues ever pulled off, and the man in command of the ship had no part in it. Asked afterwards why he had left before his passengers, Avranis gave the line that followed him for the rest of his life. "When I order abandon ship, it doesn't matter what time I leave. Abandon is for everybody. If some people like to stay, they can stay." He said he had gone ahead in order to organize the rescue from outside, and that he tried to fly back to the ship, but the weather made boarding impossible. His employer backed him, arguing that crew have to get into the boats first in order to help passengers. And then there's the detail no scriptwriter would dare invent. Later that morning, from dry land, the captain telephoned the ship's magician, who was still working the evacuation, to ask how things were going. In 1992, a Greek board of inquiry found Avranis and a group of his officers negligent for leaving without properly helping their passengers. He never spent a night in prison. His line gave him command of a ferry, and he ran it until he retired. Being handed a fresh ferry after that verdict is like giving Icarus a new pair of wings, a route map, and a company parking space with his name on it. The other side of the ledger, in March 1992, a South African serviceman who had worked the winch that day was decorated for it.
and the guitarist went back to sea and eventually became a cruise director, which is to say he was finally given the job he had already done. So tell me in the comments, does his line, "It doesn't matter what time I leave," actually hold up? Is the captain the last man off because it's the law, or because we like the story? I read these, and this one I want to argue about. Here's what the Oceanos actually leaves behind, and it isn't a coward in a helicopter. Everyone assumes the chain of command is the thing holding a ship together. That night, it turned out to be the one component that could go missing without the ship noticing. What held was smaller and much less official. A magician who kept a room calm, a singer who kept singing, a cruise director counting people into boats, a woman sending passengers out 2 at a time, a guitarist tied to a deck. And the ship was doomed months before any of them clocked in, not by a storm, but by a repair somebody decided was finished when it wasn't. 571 people went into that storm. 571 came home. The men with the gold braid on their sleeves are a footnote in their own disaster, and the band is the reason there is no memorial to read out. If you want more files where the official version falls apart on contact with what actually happened, subscribe and turn on the bell, and unlike a certain captain, I promise to still be here when it gets interesting. This has been Mortwick, The Dark Records. Rank is something you're given. Command is something you take, usually at the worst possible moment and usually by accident. I'll see you in the next file.